Web forms, the page lifecycle. Now, the main point of this nugget is going to be to discuss the lifecycle or the processing stages of an ASP.NET web page. However, along the way, there's some other details we're going to discuss, like the isPostBack and isValid properties, how to dynamically create controls, when controls are available to you within the page lifecycle, when and where and how to access control values within that lifecycle, and how to override page events so that you can gain some hooks into the overall page lifecycle. So let's start with the page lifecycle. Now, this is a series of stages that ASP.NET follows whenever it needs to process a web page. So the first thing that happens is called the page request. This is sent by the client, which is usually a web browser, to the server. And at this point, ASP.NET determines whether or not it needs to actually parse the ASP.NET file or the ASPX file off of disk, compile it into a little mini ASP.NET application and execute it, or whether it has a cached version of the page that can be sent without actually having to run all the code. So a static page that never really changes, it can probably send a cached copy. A dynamic page that's always a little bit different, it's going to have to actually run the page. If it decides to run the page, the next stage is start. Now, this is where certain page properties like request and response are set, and this is also where the page determines whether or not the request is a postback or a new request. So here's how it kind of works. We've got a server, and it sends a page to a client. So this is the server, this is the client, the web browser. The web page displays, this is a new request, and let's say it's got a form or some checkboxes or text boxes, whatever else. Maybe just a button that the user is going to click. When the user fills those out and clicks the button, that information is sent back to the server in something called a postback. So the start stage is where the server determines if this is in fact a postback, and it will set an isPostback property to true or false, depending on whether or not this is a postback. It also sets the UI culture of the page, and that's something we'll talk about during globalization in nugget number 5. So that's all in start. The next step is initialization. So in this stage, the controls in the page are finally available to your code. They've been created, and each control's unique ID property is set. If there's a master page and any themes, they're integrated into the page. However, if the request is a postback, the controls have not yet been loaded with their posted back data. In other words, the controls are not yet initialized. That happens in the next stage called load. So if the current request is a postback, then this is where the control properties are loaded with the information that was recovered from the view state. Your code will tend to go here in postback event handling. So if the request is a postback, let's say the user clicked a button, this is where that button's click event will actually be executed. After all that happens, the validate method of all of your validator controls are called. And so those validator controls, which is something we'll talk about in nugget number 6, those have an isValid property, and that will be set to true or false depending on whether or not each validator was valid. So you're validating user input at this stage. And then the page itself has a top-level isValid property, which will be set to true if all of the underlying validators were true. The next step, now that all the code has executed, is rendering. And this is where the view state is constructed and sent out to the user. The page calls the render method for each control, giving it a way to write the HTML that will visually create that control. So it writes that HTML, sends it off to the client, and the last phase is unload. At this point, everything's been rendered. We've sent all the HTML off to the client, and we're ready to discard everything. So it does a little bit of cleanup and everything else. So that's the overall life cycle. Now let's talk about a couple of different things that you need to be able to do as part of that life cycle. So I've got several things going on here that I kind of want to call out. First of all, let's take a look at this private sub page init. it is handling the MyBase init event, which is fired when the page is initializing. In here, well, actually right before that, you'll notice that I've created a text box control, and here I'm actually instantiating that, giving it an ID, and dynamically adding it to the page. So I'm adding it to the page's controls collection. Now the C# syntax is obviously very slightly different, but it's the same basic idea. So this is how to dynamically create a control at runtime. You are usually going to want to do that in the init event, and because that's where the ASP.NET is already sort of constructing its control hierarchy, so adding controls at this point is no big deal. There are some very specifics to how ASP.NET works when you add controls at a different phase in the life cycle. Essentially, each of the phases I ran through has got 3 events that will fire. So for the initialization, you've got pre-init, init, which is the one I'm grabbing right here, and init complete. For load, you've got preload, load, and then your control events execute, and then load complete. For render, you've got pre-render, pre-render complete, save state complete, which is what's raised after the view state has been constructed, then the actual render, and then unload. Now, there are a few additional considerations, and those are primarily called catch-up events. So you'll notice here I've created this text box in the init stage. That's going to be fine. However, if controls are created dynamically at runtime and they're data-bound controls, their events might not initially be synchronized with those of the other controls on the page. So the init and load event might occur much later in the page lifecycle for those controls than the same events for controls that were created declaratively in the HTML itself. From the time that those dynamically created controls, like my text box here, are created, they raise their events one after the other until they have caught up to the event during which it was added. So if you do wind up adding a text box later in the life cycle, they will fire their init, load, and so forth events until they catch up to the point where you are in the life cycle, so that everybody catches up to that same phase. But init is a good place to add those things. So there's something else I've done here that I want to kind of point out, and that's right here. Here I'm actually overriding the onload event. So rather than allowing the ASP.NET's basic unload functionality to occur, I'm overriding that and saying I want you to run my code instead. And so I can put my code in here, and if I still want the underlying ASP.NET unload functionality to run, I can manually call that, passing in whatever arguments were passed into me, but that can happen at any time I want to. In this case, I get the opportunity to do a bunch of my stuff first. So you can kind of see how this then falls together. I've got another subroutine here that's handling the load event. So this is stuff that would occur during the load event. And again, this is typically where the majority of your code is actually going to go. This is where you want to manipulate the contents of controls, figure out what to display on the page, and so forth. Populate controls, anything else. And down here you can see I've got another an event handler for a button that I've put onto the form. So here's what the page looks like. I've got a checkbox. Oops, come back here. I've got a checkbox and a button. So this is the event handler that is handling that button's click event. And here's how you would actually access the contents of the individual controls on the page. Just checkbox1.checked will tell me whether or not that checkbox on the page has actually been checked by the user. So this is sort of how the entire page lifecycle goes together, where you're going to put your code in that lifecycle, and how you can accomplish kind of some of the key tasks that are associated with this lifecycle. Accessing the contents of controls, dynamically creating controls, overriding events so that you can sort of manually add some of your own mojo to this lifecycle, and so forth. Now, I think in terms of information you should be expected to know, that list of events is probably one of the more important ones. So let me run through it again in a little bit more detail. First of all, we have pre-init, init, and init complete. And this is the initialization stage of the page lifecycle. Pre-init is raised after the start stage, so this is after the request is complete, but before the actual initialization stage actually begins. You're going to use pre-init to check the isPostback property to determine whether or not this is the first time the page is being processed. The isCallback and isCrossPage postback properties are also set. This is a good place to create or recreate dynamic controls. If you're going to set a master page dynamically, or set a theme property dynamically, or read or set profile properties dynamically, this is a good place to do all of that. Keep in mind that if the page is a postback, the values of the controls have not yet been restored from the view state. If you set a control property here, it might be overwritten in the next step when the view state is restored. So the next event that fires is init, and this is raised after all the controls have been initialized, any skin settings have been applied. The init event of the individual controls occurs before the init event of the page. This is a good place to read or initialize control properties. Finally, you've got init complete. This is raised at the end of the initialization stage, and only one operation really takes place in between these guys, and that's the tracking of view state changes is now turned on. So view state tracking is what enables a control like a text box to persist any values that are programmatically added to the view state collection. So until view state tracking is turned on, any values that you add to the view state are lost across a postback. So controls typically turn on view state tracking immediately after they raise their init event. Now this is a good place in the init complete to make changes to the view state that you want to make sure are saved after the next postback. And so the next stage is the load stage, and that consists of three events: preload, load. Well, actually it consists of more than that. Let's talk about preload and load first. Preload is raised after the page loads the view state for itself and all of its controls, and after it processes any postback data. So at this point, everything is set. The view state, the postback information has been loaded. In the load event, the page object will call the onload method of the page object, and then recursively does that for each child control until the page and all of its controls are loaded into memory. So the load event of each individual control occurs after the load event of the page. You can use the onload event to set properties and controls. This is a good place to establish database connections and do any other setup that needs to happen in order for the rest of the page to be able to operate. The next thing that executes are control events. This is where things like button clicks or text boxes, text changed happen. Now, keep in mind, in a postback request, if your page contained validator controls, this is where you would check the isValid property of the page and of the individual validation controls before you go any further. If the page is not valid, you don't want to continue doing anything else. The next event that occurs is load complete. This happens after the load stage is finished, and this is where you're going to run any tasks that require all of the controls on the page to be loaded. So the next phase is the render phase, and this consists of, well, several different events actually, so let's kind of walk through them. We've got pre-render, pre-render complete. You start to get the feeling that we're running out of good things to call the events at this point. Save state complete, then render. So this is the render stage, and really the last thing that happens is unload. So we'll talk about him in just a second too. Might as well write him on the page though. So in the pre-render, this happens after the page object has created all of the controls that are going to be required in order to render the page. That includes child controls of any composite controls. The page object will then raise the pre-render event on the page object, and again recursively for each child control, so that the pre-render event of every single individual control will occur after the pre-render event for the entire page. This is your last chance to make changes to the content of the page or its controls. After this, you need to leave off. You're done. Pre-render complete is called after each data-bound control, whose data source ID property is set, has called its data bind method. Now we're going to talk about data binding much later. Save state complete is called after the view state and the control state have been saved for the page and for all controls. Any changes to the page, any changes to the controls at this point will affect the rendering because we haven't rendered yet. In other words, if you go to change the value of a control, a text box within save state complete, it will change what the user sees, but it will not change the view state, which means if that gets posted back, your change will have been lost. So let's say that a text box has been set to value A, and you in the save state complete change that to B. The user will see B, but the user's state will have A in it. So when this gets posted back to your server, you're going to see A, not B. So this is kind of a bad place to go changing control properties. Once save state complete is up, render happens. Now this isn't actually an event. At this stage of processing, the page object calls the render method of each control. Every ASP.NET web server control has a render method, and each control uses this to write out its actual markup language, HTML, that is going to be sent to the browser. When you create a custom control, you're usually overriding the render method so that you can manually output the control's markup. So you're not going to really override this on a page level. It's not a page level event. Finally, when all that's done, the unload event is raised for each control, and then the unload event is raised for the page. And this is a good place to tear down database connections, do any final cleanup, close files, finish logging, anything else. Now, during the unload stage, keep in mind that the page and all of its controls have been rendered. You cannot make changes to the response stream at this point. If you try to do so, you will get an exception. So that's kind of the entire process in all of its gory detail. In this nugget, we talked about the page lifecycle and all of its gory details and all the different events that are raised as part of that lifecycle and what type of tasks you'll typically perform in each of those events. You saw where is postback and is valid are set, saw how to dynamically create controls, and learned when to do that during the lifecycle. You saw when controls are available during the lifecycle and when and how you would normally access those controls and their properties and methods. You also saw how to override page events so that you could gain some control and hooks into the page lifecycle. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to